What's up guys, my name is Recon and today we're on schedule 1 and we're going to be taking a look at all the NPCs, their routes and locations. First off is Kyle. He lives near the bungalow, taco tickler at 7 a.m, back home at 10 p.m. Now for Austin. Lives in the same house, leaves his house at 7 a.m, walks to the community center, leaves the community center at 10 a.m, sits on the bench behind it, leaves the bench at 11:30 and walks to taco tickler. Leaves Taco Tickler at 1:45 and walks to the arcade. Back home for the night at 11 o'clock. Now for Jessi. She lives in the motel. She leaves the motel room at 11 o'clock and walks to the front of Taco Tickler. Leaves Taco Tickler at 12:30 and walks to an alley behind Town Hall. Disappears from Town Hall at 4 o'clock and goes to the bench at the docks. Leaves the bench at 7 o'clock and walks to the streetlight at the docks warehouse. At 9 o'clock she goes back home. Now for Kathy. She lives at the apartments beside the bungalow. At 7:35 she leaves and walks to the community center. At 8:10 she leaves community center and walks to the waterfront. At 9:10 she walks back to the community center. At 1:20 she leaves and walks to the gas station. At 2:30 she leaves and walks to the bench beside the statue. 6:30 she leaves and goes home for the night. Now for Sam. He lives in the suburbs. He leaves his house at 9 a.m. and drives to his construction site. 10 o'clock he's standing in front. 12 o'clock he walks inside. 4:30 he walks out to talk to Donna. 6 o'clock he leaves and walks to the supermarket. At 8:45 he leaves and goes back home. Now for Donna. She stays in the motel office. She leaves at 4:30 p.m. to talk to Sam. She walks to the bridge at 6 p.m. and at 8 p.m. she leaves and walks back to the office. It's Peggy. She lives at the apartment behind the basketball court. 8:45 she leaves the apartment and walks to Pillville. 9:15 she teleports from Pillville to Slop Shop. 1:40 she walks to the barber shop. At 3:30 she stands in front of the barber shop. At 5 o'clock she walks back into Slop Shop. 8:45 she teleports back home. Now for Beth. She lives in the motel. At 8 o'clock she leaves the motel and walks to the Highland Tower 2. At 12:40 she leaves the tower and walks to the parking garage. 2:50 she leaves the parking garage and walks back to the tower. At 4:50 she walks behind the warehouse. At 7:15 she walks back to her motel room. And now for Ludwig. He lives in the apartment behind Slop Shop. He leaves at 7:15 and walks to the pizzeria. 12:50 he takes a break. 2:50 he goes back inside the pizzeria. At 9 o'clock he goes home for the night. Now for Peter. He lives in the motel. 9:15 he leaves and walks to the gas mart. 10:30 he leaves and walks to the statue. 11:15 he leaves and walks to behind the warehouse. At 1:30 he walks to Taco Tickler. 2:30 he walks to Thrifty Threads. At 4 o'clock he leaves and walks to the pizzeria. At 7:15 he walks to sit in front of the gun range. At 8:45 he goes home for the night. Geraldine. He lives behind the pizzeria. At 9 o'clock he leaves and stands outside. 10 o'clock he walks to the waterfront table. At 11:30 he walks to his hut. At 3:45 he walks to the construction site to talk to Jerry. At 5:30 he leaves and walks to Jerry's campsite. 7:50 he teleports back home. Now for Mick. He lives behind Gas Mart. 7 o'clock he's at the pawn shop. 6 o'clock he leaves and walks to his truck either at his house or across the street. Then he drives to Bud's bar. At 10 o'clock he goes back home. Now for Chloe. She lives behind Slop Shop. She works at Gas Mart all day and leaves at 6 p.m. and walks to the bus stop. At 7:30 she leaves and walks back to her apartment. Mr. Benji lives at the motel. And for Albert, he's on call. Now for Trent. He lives at the blue house near the bungalow. He leaves at 8 o'clock and walks to the pawn shop. 10 o'clock he leaves and walks to the corner by the Highland Range. 12:30 he leaves and walks to the docks building. 4:30 he walks to the bridge beside Thrifty Threads. 6:30 he leaves and walks to the piss hut. At 8:30 he walks home for the night. Now for Meg. She lives near the bungalow. She's at the gas mart all day. 6 p.m. she goes home for the night. Now for Joyce. 9:30 she comes out of the RV. 10:30 she walks to the tattoo shop. At 11:30 she walks to the bench near the motel. 2 o'clock she walks to the supermarket. 4:30 she walks to the corner behind Slop Shop. 7 o'clock she goes home for the night. Now for Keith. He lives at the apartments beside the bungalow. 8:40 he walks to the waterfront. At 10:30 he walks to the gas mart corner. At 12 o'clock he walks to Taco Tickler. At 3 o'clock, he walks to the piss hut. At 4 o'clock, he walks to the trash can behind the tattoo shop. At 8 o'clock, he goes home for the night. Now for Jerry. At 9:50, he walks to the soda machine and then back to his tent. At 12:20, he walks to the community center. At 3:45, he walks to the construction site. At 5:30, he walks behind the warehouse. At 9:20, he leaves the warehouse and walks home for the night. Miss Doras. She lives with Mick behind the gas mart. 7 o'clock, she walks to the warehouse. 10 o'clock, she walks to Thrifty Threads. At 1:50, she walks to the pawn shop. At 3:15, she walks to the community center. 6:15, she goes home for the night. Now for Kim. She lives behind the basketball court. At 8:45, she walks to the water near Geraldine's. 10:30, she walks to the piss hut. At 11 p.m., she walks to Slop Shop. At 11:50, she teleports back home. Mr. Charles. This is across from the community center. Walks to the piss hut at 1 p.m. 3 p.m., he walks to the bus stop across from the pawn shop. At 5:10, he walks to the gas mart where he stays all night. Big Dean. He lives right beside the bungalow. He's at the tattoo shop all day. He leaves at 8 p.m. and goes home for the night. Now for George. He lives right beside Dean. 8 o'clock, he walks to the sidewalk across from his house. At 9:15, he walks to the supermarket. At 11:30, he walks to the corner behind Taco Tickler. 12:45, he walks to the bench in front of the skateboard shop. 3 o'clock, he walks to Bud's bar. At 2 a.m., he walks home for the night. Now for Molly. She lives in the apartment right beside the bungalow. And Shirley, she's on call. Now for Elizabeth. She lives behind Slop Shop. She leaves at 10:50 and walks to the Slop Shop. 1 o'clock, she walks to the gas mart beside the mech shop. At 2:20, she walks to the building at the docks. At 5:50, she walks to the bench at the end of the docks. At 7:15, she walks to the building at the docks. At 10 o'clock, she teleports to the bench at the basketball court. At 1 a.m., she goes home for the night. Now for Jennifer. She lives behind Slop Shop. 10:45, she walks to the boutique shop. At 12:50, she walks to the table behind Highland Tower 2. At 3:30, she leaves the table and walks to the casino for the night. Now for Lucy. She lives behind Slop Shop. 7:05, she walks to the alley behind the skateboard shop. At 9:15, she walks to Pillville. At 11:20, she walks to the bench at the basketball court. At 1:20, she walks back to Pillville. And at 6:30, she goes home for the night. Now for Luis. He lives in the apartment across from Taco Tickler. 11:45, he walks to the piss hut. At 1:10, he walks to the supermarket. At 3:50, he walks to the alley behind Crimson Cranery. At 5:40, he walks to Les Ordres Puantes. 1:30, he walks back to his apartment. Now for Kevin. He lives in the same apartment. He's sitting outside the casino at 7 o'clock. 7:45, he walks to the supermarket. 12:30, he walks to the bench in front of Town Hall. At 2 o'clock, he walks back to the supermarket. 6 o'clock, he walks outside the supermarket. At 7 o'clock, he walks to the piss hut. And at 8 o'clock, he walks back home. And now for Randy. He lives at the Randy's Bait and Tackle. 11 o'clock, he walks to the supermarket. 4 o'clock, he teleports back to the docks. At 7 o'clock, he walks back inside for the night. Now for Greg. He lives right behind the casino. 11 o'clock, he walks to the piss hut. At 12:20, he walks to the car wash parking lot. At 2 o'clock, he walks to Mac's house at the docks. At 4:45, he teleports to the rocks below the manor. 7:30, he teleports to the Slop Shop. 10 o'clock, he walks to Bud's bar. At 3 o'clock, he goes home for the night. Now we have Jeff. Lives across from Taco Tickler. He's at the skateboard shop till 6 p.m. He goes to pizzeria and 8 p.m. he goes home. Now we have Phillip. He lives at the mayor's house. 11:30, he walks to the laundromat. At 1:20, he walks to the back of Slop Shop. 3 o'clock, he walks to the casino for the night. And now Eugene. He lives behind Slop Shop. 7:20, he walks to Highland Tower 2. 12:20, he walks to the supermarket. At 1 o'clock, he walks to the table behind Highland Tower 2. 2:20, he walks to Ham Legal Services. 3:30, he walks back to Highland Tower 2. At 6:45, he walks behind Gas Mart with the mech shop. At 8 p.m., he goes home. And Brad lives under the parking garage. And now we have Lisa. She lives at the docks house. At 8:15, she walks to the bus stop. At 9:15, she teleports to Highland Medical. At 2 o'clock, she walks to the fountain in front of Town Hall. 3:20, she walks back to Highland Medical. 7:20, she walks to a machine beside Handy Hanks. At 7:50, she teleports back home. Now for Javier. He lives at the doc's house. 11:30, he teleports to the pizzeria. 2:45, he teleports to the dealership. At 5:30, he walks to the gas mart for the night. Now for Anna. She's at the hair salon all day. 6 p.m. she walks across the street. 8 p.m. she walks home for the night. Cranky Frank. He lives at the campsite. 9:15, he walks to the tattoo shop. 11:05, he walks to the bus stop behind the construction site. 2:10, he walks the container beside Geraldine's. 6:25, he walks to the pizzeria. At 8:20, he walks to the piss hut. At 10 o'clock, he walks to the woods beside the motel. 12:30, he walks to Taco Tickler. 2 o'clock, he goes home. Now for Genghis. He lives in a container at the docks. 11:20, he walks outside to smoke. 12:10, he walks to the pawn shop. 2:50, he walks to the slop shop. 5:20, he walks to the church. 7:45, he walks to the hospital. 9:30, he walks to the sidewalk across from Handy Hank. 11:45, he teleports home. Now for Marco. He lives in front of the docks. He's at the mech shop all day. 6 p.m. he leaves and walks to the supermarket. 7:45 he walks to the outside of the casino. 9 o'clock he walks home for the night. Now for Mac. He lives right beside the docks warehouse. 2:35 he walks to the bus stop. 4:25 he walks to the yellow house in the suburbs. 7 o'clock he teleports home for the night. Now for Billy. He lives at the docks house. 7:50 he drives to the chemical plant. 11:50 he walks to the gas mart. 1:15 he walks to the outside of the chemical plant. 3 o'clock he walks back inside. 5:30 he walks to the bench at the water behind the community center. 8 p.m. he drives home for the night. Now for Melissa. She lives in the mayor's house. 9:20 she teleports to the bench at the docks walkway. 10:50 she teleports to Dean's house. 1 o'clock she walks to the casino for the night. And for Jane, she lives under the bridge near the docks. Salvador, he's on call. Now we have Chris. Teleports to bank at 1 p.m. 6:40 walks behind Highland Tower 2. 8 p.m. he walks back to the bank. Now for Karen. She lives in this house in the suburbs. At 7 o'clock she's at the pond bench in the suburbs. 9 p.m. she drives her car to the parking garage. 2 p.m. she walks to the casino. 6 p.m. she walks to the bench behind Highland Tower 2. 7:30 she walks back to the casino. 10 p.m. she drives home for the night. Now for Alison. She lives in this house in the suburbs. 7 a.m. she's in the boutique store. 9 o'clock she drives to Highland Tower 2. 2 o'clock she walks behind Highland Tower 2 and stands there. 3:30 she walks back inside. 6:30 she drives home for the night. Now for Hank. He lives in the house before the manor. He's at Handy Hank's all day. 8:05 p.m. he drives home. Now for Carl. This is his house. 11 o'clock he walks to the docks behind the bus stop. 3 o'clock he walks to Crimson Granary for the night. Now for Jeremy. This is his house. He's at the dealership all day. 6 p.m. he leaves and drives home for the night. Now for Jackie. This is her house. 4:30 p.m. she leaves and walks to meet Pearl. 6 p.m. she leaves and drives home for the night. And now for Harold. He lives in the yellow house in the suburbs. 7 a.m. he's at the water by the casino. 8:45 he walks to Highland Tower 2. 12 o'clock he walks to the church. At 1:50 he walks back to Highland Tower 2. At 5:05 he walks in front of Town Hall. 6:30 he walks back to Highland Tower 2. At 9:20 he walks to his car and drives home. And now for Dennis. He lives in the suburbs. At 11:40 he walks to Town Hall. At 12:45 he walks to the bench in front of the boutique. At 1:50 he walks to the fire station. 6 o'clock he walks to the slop shop and then home for the night. Now for Jack. 10 o'clock he walks to the gazebo in the suburbs. 12:15 he teleports to the hospital. At 3:30 he walks outside of the hospital. At 4:15 he teleports to Pillville. At 6:45 he teleports home. And now for Lilly. She lives across from the church. 7:55 she walks to beside Butterbox. 8:40 she walks inside Butterbox. 4 p.m. she walks to the bank. 5:30 she walks to the fountain at the town hall. And at 8:30 she goes home for the night. Now for Fiona. She lives across from the church. She's at Thrifty Threads all day. 6 p.m. she walks home for the night. Now for Jen. She lives across from the church. At 7:30, she leaves the apartment in front of the church and walks to town hall. 6 p.m. she leaves and walks home for the night. Now for Walter. He lives at the church. At 10:30, he walks across the street. At 1 p.m. he drives to the community center. At 4:10, he drives home for the night. And now for Ray. He lives across from the church. He's at the realty place all day. 6 p.m. he walks across the street. 7 p.m. he walks to the bank. And 8 p.m. he walks home for the night. Now for Herbert. He lives across from the church. He's at the boutique store all day. He walks in front of the fire station. At 7:20 he walks to the bank. At 7:55 he walks home for the night. Now for Tobias. He lives at the mayor's house. 9 o'clock he walks to the table behind Tower 2. 11:20 he walks to town hall. 2:15 he walks to slop shop. 3:45 he walks back to town hall. 5:20 he walks in front of town hall. 6:40 he walks to PD. 8:30 he walks home for the night. Now for Pearl. She lives at the church. At 7:30 she walks to the bus stop. 9:05 she walks to the hospital. At 11:10 she walks to the courthouse. 1:20 she walks to the ATM and then to the post office. At 4:30 she walks to the canal to talk to Jackie. At 6 p.m. she walks home for the night. Now for Micheal. He lives in the mansion. At 8:20 he walks to his backyard. At 9:30 he drives to Highland Tower 2 and walks to the supermarket. At 1:40 he walks to the Ham Legal Services. At 3:30 he drives to the boutique store and then home for the night. And now Leah lives in a shipping container to the left of the church. Then you've got Manny, Stan, and Oscar. They all three stay in the warehouse. That's it for the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you guys next time.